In Lagos, people spoke Obinna Nwoy's name with admiration. His billboard stood along major roads, his face smiled from business magazines, and his presence at events caused whispers to spread through halls before he even arrived. He was known as a man who rose from nothing and became everything. To many, his story was inspiration. To a few, it was suspicious. To himself, it was a memory he could never escape. Obinna lived in a gated estate in Lekki, where houses stood like monuments to success. His own home was tall, painted in calm colors, guarded day and night. Inside, marble floors reflected soft lights, and the air always smelled faintly of expensive fragrance. Anyone visiting would think peace lived there. But peace had left long ago. His wife, Ifunanya, moved quietly through the house, her beauty still intact but her eyes carrying questions she never asked aloud. Their children attended the best schools in Lagos, wore fine clothes, and spoke politely, yet something invisible pressed down on them. They laughed less. They avoided their father's gaze. Obinna noticed everything. He simply chose not to care. Each morning, he dressed carefully, adjusting his cufflinks with precision. Wealth had taught him control. Or perhaps control had taught him wealth. As he stood before the mirror, he sometimes searched his own reflection, as if expecting another face to appear behind his own. He remembered when life was different. There was a time he could barely afford transport fare in Enugu. A time when his phone rang only with debt reminders and disappointment. A time when hunger humbled him daily. Those memories burned hotter than any insult. He had promised himself then that poverty would never touch him again, no matter the cost. Now, as cars waited outside to take him to meetings where millions were discussed casually, Obinna felt untouchable. Lagos bowed to money, and he had plenty of it. Contracts came easily. Officials returned his calls quickly. Doors opened before he knocked. Still, at night, when the house grew quiet and the city's noise softened into distant hums, Obinna sat alone in his study. He locked the door. He poured himself a drink he barely tasted. His eyes rested on nothing, yet his mind replayed the moment everything changed. The moment he said yes. He told himself it was necessity. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself his family would never truly suffer. Those lies had helped him sleep in the beginning. Now they no longer worked. From the upper floor, a child coughed softly in their sleep. The sound traveled down the hallway like an accusation. Obinna's jaw tightened. He stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back harder than necessary. "This is what success demands," he whispered to the empty room. But the room did not answer. It never did. Outside, Lagos continued to shine, unaware that one of its brightest men had built his empire on a promise that would not stop collecting. Before Lagos knew Obinna Nwoy, before the cars, the guards, and the wide smiles on magazine covers, there was Enugu and a very different life. Enugu was where Obinna learned what it meant to be invisible. He lived then in a narrow apartment behind a mechanic workshop, a place where the smell of oil mixed with damp walls. The roof leaked when it rained, and the sound of water hitting metal buckets often woke him in the night. He shared the space with his wife, Ifunanya, who was newly married to hope rather than comfort, and their first child, who cried often from heat and hunger. Every morning, Obinna left the house early, wearing the same carefully ironed shirt, pretending it was new. He walked with confidence even when his stomach was empty. Pride was the last thing he owned, and he guarded it fiercely. He had studied hard. He had plans. He believed effort would be rewarded. But Enugu was not kind to belief. His small trading business failed slowly, painfully. Goods stayed unsold. Transport costs rose. Customers promised to return and never did. Creditors came politely at first, then impatiently, then angrily. They stood outside his door. They called his phone repeatedly. They spoke his name with disappointment. Obinna learned the sound of shame. Friends who once greeted him warmly began to avoid him. Family members stopped picking his calls. At social gatherings, conversations went quiet when he arrived. People measured him with their eyes and saw failure. Ifunanya never complained openly, but Obinna noticed how she ate less, how she stretched meals, how she avoided talking about the future. At night, she turned her face away when she cried, thinking he slept. He did not sleep. He lay awake counting debts in his head, calculating how many months he had before everything collapsed completely. He imagined eviction. He imagined his child growing up knowing hunger as a friend. Each thought pressed heavier on his chest. One afternoon, after a public argument with a supplier who shouted at him in front of others, Obinna walked home slowly. The sun felt too hot. The streets felt too narrow. Every step felt like a reminder of how low he had fallen. That was the day something inside him shifted. He sat alone on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, and whispered words he never thought he would say. He questioned ideas he once rejected with anger. He remembered stories he heard growing up, stories of men who rose suddenly, stories people spoke about in hushed voices, stories followed by silence. He shook his head violently, as if to throw the thoughts away. I am not that kind of man, he told himself. But desperation has a way of returning thoughts you bury. When the landlord came with a warning, when school fees remained unpaid, when Ifunanya sold her jewelry quietly to buy food, Obinna's resistance weakened. His prayers became shorter. His anger became louder. His fear became constant. He began to notice patterns. Some men never seemed to struggle. Some businesses never failed. Some people escaped consequences that crushed others. He started asking himself why effort worked for some and destroyed others. One evening, sitting outside the apartment as darkness settled over Enugu, Obinna made a silent promise. He would never be poor again. Not tomorrow. Not ever. At that moment, the idea that once disgusted him no longer felt impossible. It felt tempting. It felt like an answer waiting patiently. And though he did not act yet, though no decision was spoken aloud, Obinna crossed an invisible line that night. Because from that point on, he was no longer asking if there was another way. He was asking how soon he could find it. Port Harcourt was supposed to be Obinna's turning point. Instead, it became the place where his last certainty collapsed. He arrived in the city with borrowed money and borrowed confidence, believing a new contract would rescue him from the slow drowning he was experiencing in Enugu. The oil-rich city moved fast, louder and sharper than what he was used to. Tall buildings rose beside muddy roads. Wealth sat openly beside poverty, neither pretending the other did not exist. For the first few days, Obinna felt hope again. Meetings were scheduled. Promises were made. He imagined returning home with good news, imagined Ifunanya smiling without forcing it, imagined creditors going silent. Then everything fell apart. The partner who had invited him suddenly stopped answering calls. A deal he was counting on was cancelled without explanation. Money he had spent on logistics vanished without return. By the fifth day, Obinna was sitting alone in a cheap hotel room, staring at his phone, watching the last of his balance disappear. He did not cry. He felt past that. That evening, unable to remain indoors, he walked out into the humid Port Harcourt night. The air smelled of fuel and rain. He walked without direction, passing bars filled with laughter he could not join, restaurants he could not afford, and streets where strangers moved with purpose he lacked. Eventually, he stopped at a quiet roadside spot where a few plastic chairs were arranged under a dim light. An old man sat there alone, drinking calmly, as if he had been waiting for someone. Obinna did not know why he sat down. They did not speak at first. The silence stretched comfortably, disturbingly so. Then the man turned slightly and spoke without looking at him. "You carry failure like a heavy coat," the man said. Obinna stiffened. He almost stood up. "I do not know you," Obinna replied sharply. The man smiled faintly. "Yet I know you have come far and returned with nothing." Obinna's heart beat faster. He searched the man's face for mockery but found none. The man's eyes were calm, almost gentle, but they seemed to see too much. "You borrowed to come here," the man continued. "You hoped this city would save you. It did not." Obinna stood up this time. "I think you have mistaken me for someone else." The man finally turned fully toward him. "Sit," he said softly. "Or go. Either way, what is chasing you will follow." Those words stopped Obinna. He sat back down slowly, his hands trembling despite himself. The man introduced himself simply as someone who listened. He did not ask Obinna's name. He did not need to. Instead, he spoke about men who struggled quietly, men whose efforts were ignored, men who watched others rise effortlessly while they sank. Obinna felt exposed. There are paths effort alone cannot open, the man said. There are doors that respond only to sacrifice. Obinna laughed nervously. I am not interested in shortcuts. The man nodded. No one ever is. Until the road breaks their legs. They spoke for a long time, though Obinna could not later remember exactly what was said. The conversation felt less like talking and more like being led gently somewhere dark. The man never used clear words. He never described actions. He spoke in suggestions, in meanings, in pauses that felt heavier than speech. There is power, the man said at last, but power always asks for something close. Not immediately. Not all at once. But gradually. Obinna swallowed. And the cost? The man's smile faded slightly. If I explain it clearly, you will run. If I don't, you will think you are strong enough to manage it. Silence fell again. Obinna stood up slowly. His legs felt weak. I need time, he said. The man nodded, as if expecting nothing else. You already have time, he replied. What you lack is courage. As Obinna walked away, he felt lighter and heavier at the same time. He told himself the man was nothing. A coincidence. A trick of desperation. Yet that night, lying on his hotel bed, Obinna realized something terrifying. For the first time, someone had not only seen his pain. They had offered to remove it. And he had not said no. Obinna returned to Enugu carrying more than failure. He carried a quiet awareness that something had shifted permanently inside him. The stranger in Port Harcourt did not follow him, did not call him, did not send messages. That absence was more unsettling than persistence would have been. It gave Obinna space to convince himself that the encounter had been meaningless. But meaning has a way of returning when silence grows heavy. Days passed. Debts returned. Reality resumed its slow punishment. Yet Obinna now noticed something different in himself. Where panic once lived, there was calculation. Where fear once screamed, there was a low, steady voice reminding him of what had been offered. What is closest to your heart? The words replayed often, especially at night. When the stranger appeared again, it was not dramatic. No warning. No mystery. Obinna was sitting alone in a quiet corner of a nearly empty cafe, counting money he did not have, when the man sat across from him as if the seat had always been reserved. You look thinner, the man said calmly. Obinna did not ask how he found him. That question felt useless. I have thought about what you said, Obinna replied carefully. I do not understand it. The man nodded. Understanding is not required. Acceptance is. Obinna leaned forward. You said success needs what is closest to my heart. That could mean many things. The man's eyes softened. Exactly. That answer comforted Obinna more than it should have. Ambiguity felt safer than truth. What if I choose wrongly? Obinna asked. There is no wrong, the man said. Only sincerity. They spoke quietly, surrounded by people who did not notice anything unusual. No one would later remember seeing them together. The stranger did not demand names or actions. He did not describe ceremonies or places. He spoke instead about detachment. About priorities. About letting go of emotional weight that slowed progress. You cannot carry everyone with you to the top, the man said. Some must remain below. Obinna nodded slowly. He told himself this was philosophy. A lesson successful men understood. He thought of time spent worrying about others. Money spent fixing family problems. Energy wasted on people who contributed nothing to his survival. He thought of love. He chose to reinterpret the words carefully. Safely. When the stranger asked him to decide, Obinna made his first true choice. He did not touch anyone. He did not harm anyone physically. Instead, he withdrew something invisible but essential. He chose distance. From that day, Obinna began to emotionally abandon what he loved most, starting with his family. He spent less time at home. He stopped sharing fears with Ifunanya. He became colder, quieter, less available. When his child cried, he stayed silent. When his wife needed reassurance, he offered logic instead. He told himself this was maturity, focus, discipline. Almost immediately, things began to change. A small opportunity appeared unexpectedly. A delayed payment came through. A business contact resurfaced with new interest. It was nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to spark belief. Obinna felt relief flood his chest. He had chosen correctly. When the stranger appeared one final time to confirm the choice, Obinna spoke with confidence. "I understand now," he said. "What is closest to my heart is distraction, attachment, weakness." The man studied him quietly. "That is what you believe," he said. "And that is enough," Obinna replied. The stranger nodded once. "For now." As he walked away, Obinna felt proud. He had taken control without violence, without cruelty, without crossing lines he believed still existed. He convinced himself he had found a clean path through darkness. But that night, as Ifunanya lay awake beside him, sensing a distance she could not explain, the first crack formed in the foundation of their family. And though no blood had been spilled, something essential had already been given away. The destruction had begun quietly, patiently, and exactly as promised. The changes did not arrive like thunder. They came like soft knocks, easy to ignore, impossible to deny. At first, it was a call Obinna did not expect. A man who once dismissed his proposals now spoke with respect, even urgency. A meeting followed. Then another. Within weeks, paperwork that had been delayed for months moved quickly, smoothly, as if invisible hands were clearing obstacles ahead of him. Money began to flow. Not in reckless floods, but in steady streams that restored Obinna's confidence piece by piece. Debts were settled quietly. Creditors softened. Some disappeared entirely, as if they had never existed. A man who once threatened him publicly avoided his gaze at a gathering and left early without explanation. Obinna noticed everything. He told himself this was what perseverance finally looked like. That this was the reward for refusing to give up. But deep inside, he knew effort alone had never worked this way before. Opportunities multiplied. Contracts were approved without resistance. Documents returned signed, stamped, and praised. Bank officials smiled warmly. His name carried weight where it once carried embarrassment. Within a year, Enugu no longer fit the man he was becoming. The move to Lagos felt natural, almost inevitable. When Obinna told Ifunanya they were relocating, her first reaction was relief. Lagos meant opportunity, better schools, a fresh start. She believed hardship was finally behind them. She did not notice how carefully Obinna avoided her eyes. The estate in Lekki was everything people dreamed of. Wide roads, quiet surroundings, security gates that separated residents from the noise of the city. The house itself was large, modern, and tastefully furnished. Every room reflected success. Every corner spoke of arrival. Neighbors welcomed them warmly. They admired Obinna openly. Children played freely. From the outside, the family looked complete. Inside, something subtle was changing. Obinna provided generously. He paid school fees early. He upgraded cars. He ensured nothing was lacking materially. But he was rarely present in spirit. He returned home late. He left early. Even when he sat with his family, his mind seemed elsewhere. Ifunanya noticed that conversations no longer flowed. When she spoke about her fears or hopes, Obinna responded with brief answers. When she asked about his work, he changed the subject or offered vague explanations. "It is just stress," he told her once. "This level requires focus." She accepted it because she wanted to believe it. The children, however, felt the difference more sharply. Their father was no longer warm. His hugs felt stiff. His smile appeared practiced. They learned quickly not to ask too many questions. Obinna watched all this with controlled detachment. Each time guilt tried to surface, he silenced it with evidence. "Look at what you have given them," he told himself. "Look at the comfort. Look at the security." And every time doubt rose, something else went right. A rival business collapsed suddenly. A lawsuit against one of Obinna's companies was withdrawn without explanation. A government project he had not even applied for was offered directly to him. Doors did not just open. They waited. At night, alone in his new study overlooking the quiet streets of the estate, Obinna sometimes felt the weight of what he was becoming. But the fear of losing momentum kept him moving forward. He did not call the stranger. He did not need to. The arrangement seemed to be working perfectly. Yet, as Obinna grew more powerful in Lagos, he grew more distant from those who shared his roof. He spoke to them less. He trusted them less. He protected something inside himself fiercely, as if closeness itself had become dangerous. And though his family slept in luxury, something vital was being slowly starved. The doors had opened. But the walls within his home were beginning to rise. Ifunanya had always believed that happiness made noise. In Enugu, even in their hardest days, there had been laughter between worries, conversation between fears. They talked through problems, argued, made up, planned, and prayed together. Now, in a house filled with space and comfort, silence ruled. At first, she told herself it was Lagos. The traffic, the pressure, the responsibilities that came with Obinna's sudden rise. Successful men, people said, were often distant. Focused. Changed by necessity. But this felt different. Obinna no longer shared his thoughts. When he spoke, his words were precise, measured, as if every sentence was being calculated before release. He avoided questions about how things were going so well, how problems seemed to solve themselves. When Ifunanya asked directly, he smiled and said, "It is strategy. Experience." The smile never reached his eyes. Nights were the worst. They lay in the same bed, facing opposite directions, with a quiet that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Obinna stayed awake long after Ifunanya slept, or pretended to. Sometimes she felt his body tense beside her, as if he were listening for something. There were phone calls he took outside. Messages he deleted immediately. Meetings he never explained. His study became a private territory, always locked, always off-limits. One evening, Ifunanya entered the study unexpectedly. Obinna looked up sharply, fear flashing across his face before he replaced it with calm. "You should knock," he said quietly. "I live here," she replied, surprised by her own tone. He stood up, closed the file he was reading, and gently guided her back toward the door. The gesture was polite, but firm. That was the moment fear entered her heart. She began to observe rather than confront. She watched how Obinna reacted to success, not with gratitude or joy, but with alertness, as if expecting it to be taken away. She noticed how he avoided family gatherings, how he discouraged visits from relatives, how he isolated them slowly but completely. The children sensed it too. They whispered among themselves. They hesitated before approaching their father. When he raised his voice even slightly, they froze. One night, unable to sleep, Ifunanya walked through the quiet house. The walls were beautiful. The furniture was expensive. Yet the place felt cold. She stopped at the window and looked out at the dark streets of the estate, lit neatly, quietly. A thought came to her uninvited. Where did all this come from? She had never doubted Obinna's intelligence or ambition. But this kind of rise, this kind of protection from consequences, felt unnatural. It frightened her because it did not align with the man she married. She remembered stories from her childhood. Stories told in whispers. Stories of people who gained everything but lost themselves. She pushed the memories away, ashamed of the direction her thoughts were taking. Still, fear settled. The next day, she tried to speak to Obinna openly. She chose her words carefully, calmly. "I am grateful," she said. "I just want to understand. We feel far apart." Obinna listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once. "This level requires discipline," he said. "Emotions complicate things. Trust me." She wanted to argue. She wanted to insist. But something in his tone warned her not to push further. From that day, Ifunanya began to protect her children quietly. She kept them close. She paid attention to changes in their moods, their health, their fears. She did not know what Obinna was hiding. But she knew this wealth had a shadow. And shadows, she understood, only existed when something blocked the light. The stranger returned on a night when Lagos was unusually quiet. Obinna had stayed late at his office, reviewing documents that showed numbers climbing steadily upward. His businesses were expanding faster than he had planned for, and yet instead of excitement, he felt tension. Success no longer brought relief. It brought vigilance. As he stepped into the underground parking area, the lights flickered briefly. He paused, instinctively alert. Then he saw him. The stranger stood near Obinna's car, hands folded calmly, as if he belonged there. Obinna did not shout. He did not run. He simply felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "You have done well," the stranger said, his voice low and steady. "Very well." Obinna unlocked his car slowly but did not enter. "Things are moving," he replied carefully. "As expected." The stranger nodded. "Momentum is a living thing. If you do not feed it, it turns against you." Obinna leaned against the car, crossing his arms. "You said the first choice would be enough." "For a beginning," the stranger replied. "Beginnings are cheap." Silence settled between them. The hum of distant generators filled the space. "What do you want?" Obinna asked. The stranger stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Power must be maintained. You are past the stage of symbols now." Obinna felt a chill. "Be clear." The stranger studied him for a long moment, as if measuring what could be said aloud. "The distance you created worked because it weakened bonds. But bonds do not disappear. They resist." Obinna's mind moved quickly. "I have done everything required. I have focused. I have sacrificed comfort." The stranger's expression hardened slightly. "Comfort is not the same as closeness." The words struck deeper than Obinna expected. This time, the stranger continued, "What is required is not emotional. It is personal. Tangible." Obinna's jaw tightened. "I will not harm anyone." The stranger tilted his head. "Harm is not always violent. Sometimes it is permission." "Permission for what?" Obinna asked, though he already felt the direction of the answer. "To allow loss," the stranger said quietly. "To not interfere when something meant to weaken arrives." Obinna's heart pounded. "You speak in riddles again." "Because you prefer them," the stranger replied. "Clarity removes your excuses." The stranger explained slowly, carefully. There would be a price. Something close. Something living within Obinna's circle. Not chosen by Obinna directly, but accepted by him. When the moment came, Obinna would be required to do nothing. "Do nothing?" Obinna repeated. "Yes," the stranger said. "Intervention is attachment. Acceptance is power." Obinna turned away, breathing hard. Images of his family flashed through his mind. He pushed them away immediately. "You said this path would bring security," he said. "I have children." The stranger's eyes did not soften. "Which is why the power responds to you." Obinna spun around. "I did not agree to this." "You agreed the moment you enjoyed the benefits," the stranger replied calmly. "Power is not borrowed. It is rented. And rent increases." The stranger stepped back. "You will recognize the moment. You will feel the urge to act. That is when the choice will matter." "And if I refuse?" Obinna asked. The stranger smiled faintly. "Then everything that opened will close." Quickly. The lights flickered again. When they steadied, the stranger was already walking away. Obinna stood frozen for a long time. His hands trembled despite his effort to control them. He told himself nothing had been decided. That no harm had been specified. That events happened naturally every day. As he drove home, the city lights blurred through his windshield. When he entered the house, he found Ifunanya sitting quietly in the living room, waiting. "You are late," she said. He nodded. "Work." She studied his face, searching for something. Obinna avoided her gaze. That night, as he lay awake listening to the soft breathing of his family, Obinna realized the truth he had been avoiding. The path he had chosen no longer asked him to walk forward. It asked him to stand still and let something fall. The illness began quietly, the way most disasters did in Obinna's life now, without warning and without explanation. It was his younger son, Chibuzo. At first, it seemed harmless. A mild fever. Fatigue. The kind of sickness parents dismissed easily. Ifunanya gave him warm food, medicine, and rest. Obinna watched from a distance, telling himself it was normal. Children fell ill all the time. But days passed, and the fever did not break. Chibuzo grew weaker. He stopped playing. His appetite faded. His eyes, once bright and curious, became dull and tired. He complained of feeling cold even when the room was warm. At night, his breathing sounded uneven, shallow. Ifunanya's worry turned into fear. They took him to the best hospital in Lagos. Then another. Then another. Blood tests were done. Scans were taken. Specialists were consulted. Doctors spoke in careful tones, avoiding panic but unable to provide answers. There is no clear diagnosis, one doctor said. All tests appear normal. Normal. The word felt like an insult. Obinna sat through these meetings quietly, nodding, asking practical questions. He paid without hesitation. He arranged private rooms and special attention. To the outside world, he was the image of a concerned father. Inside, he was unraveling. From the moment Chibuzo's illness worsened, Obinna had known. Not with logic, not with evidence, but with certainty. The stranger's words echoed in his mind relentlessly. You will recognize the moment. This was the moment. Every instinct in Obinna screamed for him to act. To demand answers. To fight whatever unseen force had entered his home. But another voice, calmer, colder, reminded him of the agreement. Intervention is attachment. He did not speak these words aloud. He did not explain them to himself. He simply felt them settle into his chest like a stone. At night, Obinna stood outside Chibuzo's room, listening to his breathing through the door. His hands clenched into fists. More than once, he reached for the handle, ready to go in, ready to break whatever silence was required. Each time, he stopped. He told himself doctors were handling it. He told himself panic would make things worse. He told himself he was doing what was necessary. Ifunanya noticed his restraint immediately. Why are you so calm? She asked one evening, her voice shaking. This is our child. Obinna looked at her carefully before answering. Panic will not help him, he said evenly. We must trust the process. The words sounded reasonable. They sounded responsible. They sounded nothing like the truth. Guilt began to eat at him slowly. It showed in the way he avoided Chibuzo's eyes. In the way he stayed longer at work. In the way he drank alone at night, staring at nothing. He dreamed of the stranger often now. In the dreams, the man said nothing. He only watched. As Chibuzo's condition worsened, something else happened. Obinna's businesses thrived. A major deal closed effortlessly. A legal issue vanished without explanation. A competitor withdrew from a project Obinna wanted, citing personal reasons. The contrast was unbearable. Every gain felt like an accusation. Ifunanya began sleeping in the hospital room, refusing to leave her son's side. The other children stayed with relatives, confused and frightened. The family, once together under one roof, began to fracture under the weight of fear and unanswered questions. One night, Obinna stood alone in the hospital corridor, staring at the white walls. His phone vibrated with a notification, another approval, another success. He turned the phone face down. For the first time since Port Harcourt, Obinna felt the full weight of what he had chosen. There was no ceremony. No blood. No dramatic act he could point to and say, this is where I crossed the line. Instead, there was silence. Acceptance. And a child growing weaker while everything else in his life grew stronger. When a nurse approached and asked gently if he was all right, Obinna nodded and forced a smile. Yes, he said. I am fine. The lie tasted bitter. Because Obinna knew the truth. And the truth was feeding on his silence. Lagos did not see the hospital corridors. It did not hear the quiet sobs at night or feel the heaviness that lived inside Obinna's chest. Lagos only saw results. And Lagos celebrated results loudly. Obinna's name began to appear everywhere. Business journals requested interviews. Invitations arrived weekly, then daily dinners, conferences, award ceremonies. His story was framed as inspiration, a man who rose through discipline, intelligence, and vision. People repeated his name with admiration, using it as proof that success was possible. At one ceremony held in a grand hotel on Victoria Island, Obinna sat at a round table surrounded by well-dressed strangers who praised him openly. "You are proof that hard work never fails," one man said, raising a glass. Obinna smiled politely. On stage, when his name was announced for an award recognizing outstanding business excellence, the applause was thunderous. Cameras flashed. The host spoke glowingly about his journey, about how he overcame hardship through determination. Obinna walked to the podium calmly. He thanked partners, employees, and mentors. He spoke about resilience and faith. His voice was steady. His smile was practiced. No one noticed his hands trembling slightly as he held the award. No one asked why his family was not present. Ifunanya remained at the hospital that night, sitting beside Chibuzo's bed as machines hummed softly. The child slept restlessly, his face thinner now, his breathing shallow. She did not watch the ceremony. She did not care about applause. Back in the hall, Obinna posed for photographs. People laughed with him. They asked for advice. They asked how he stayed focused, how he managed stress, how he balanced success and family. He answered carefully. "Discipline," he said. "Sacrifice." The word landed heavily in his chest. After the ceremony, his phone buzzed with messages of congratulations. He replied to none. Instead, he stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the city. Lagos glittered beneath him, alive, powerful, indifferent. From this height, everything looked perfect. Later that week, a magazine published a long feature on Obinna. It spoke of vision and leadership. It called him a self-made man. It praised his calm demeanor, his mysterious rise, his refusal to boast. Ifunanya saw the article by accident while sitting in the hospital waiting area. She stared at the smiling photograph of her husband, dressed in an expensive suit, confidence shining from his eyes. The man in the picture felt like a stranger. She folded the magazine slowly and placed it in her bag without comment. At home, the estate remained quiet. Staff moved respectfully. The other children returned occasionally, careful and subdued. No one laughed loudly anymore. No one planned far ahead. Obinna continued to succeed publicly. Privately, he avoided looking too closely at what was falling apart. Each celebration felt like an act he was performing for a city that did not know him. Each praise sounded hollow. Each award felt heavier than the last. And yet, the more Lagos lifted him up, the harder it became to step away. Because success was no longer just his, it was expected of him. Inside his home, the walls listened as silence grew deeper. Inside his heart, guilt pressed harder. But outside, under bright lights and applause, Obinna remained exactly who the city needed him to be. A man rising. Even as his family quietly unraveled behind closed doors. Fear entered the house quietly, the same way everything else had. It did not arrive as shouting or violence. It arrived as tension. As silence that stretched too long. As footsteps that made children pause mid-conversation. As a presence that felt heavier than words. The children noticed the change before anyone else. When Obinna walked into a room, conversations stopped. Laughter died quickly, as if swallowed by the walls. His eyes no longer carried warmth. They scanned, measured, observed. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried a sharp edge that made even simple instructions feel like warnings. Go to your room. Finish your food. Do not argue. The words were ordinary. The feeling behind them was not. The children began to avoid him instinctively. They learned his schedules without trying. They knew when he would be home late, when he would leave early, when it was safer to stay upstairs or remain quiet in the living room. They moved softly through the house, careful not to draw attention. Luxury surrounded them, large rooms, expensive furniture, a well-stocked kitchen, but comfort was gone. The house felt like a place to endure, not a place to rest. Chibuzo's illness made everything worse. Even when he returned home briefly between hospital visits, The children sensed something wrong. His weakness frightened them, but their father's behavior frightened them more. Obinna visited Chibuzo's room rarely. When he did, he stood stiffly by the door, asked short questions, and left quickly. The children noticed. One evening, their daughter, Adiz, whispered to her older brother, "Why does Daddy look at us like that?" He did not answer. He did not know how. They began to have dreams, disturbing ones. Dreams of being lost in the house. Dreams of calling for help and receiving silence. Dreams of their father standing far away, watching without expression. The staff noticed the change too. They lowered their voices when Obinna was home. They avoided eye contact. The house adjusted itself around him, as if he were something unpredictable. Ifunanya tried to hold the family together. She spoke gently. She encouraged openness. She hugged her children often, shielding them as best she could. But even she felt it, the shift in Obinna's energy, the unnatural weight that followed him from room to room. One night, while Obinna was away, the children gathered in their mother's room. "I do not like it here anymore," Adiz said quietly. Ifunanya pulled her close. "It is just a difficult time," she said, though doubt crept into her voice. "Things will get better." But the children did not believe her. When Obinna returned late that night, he passed their room and paused. He heard whispers, then silence. His chest tightened, not with anger, but with something colder. He had become something to fear. He told himself it was temporary. That authority often looked like intimidation. That distance was necessary. But deep down, he felt it, the same awareness that had warned him before. The house no longer responded to him with warmth. It responded with caution. One afternoon, Obinna overheard his youngest child ask a simple question. "Is Daddy angry with us?" The question struck him harder than any accusation could have. He stopped walking. For a moment, he considered entering the room, kneeling down, and telling the truth, or at least part of it. Instead, he kept walking. That was when he understood the full cost of what he was doing. His children no longer saw him as safety. They saw him as something to endure, something to avoid. The mansion stood strong. The gates were secure. The lights glowed softly at night. But inside, the sense of home had disappeared. And fear, once invited, does not leave easily. Obinna had not returned to Enugu in years. The city of his youth, with its narrow streets, crowded markets, and familiar smells, seemed smaller now, diminished by time and his own distance. Yet when business required him to visit suppliers and old contacts, he had little choice but to return. He arrived with his family, driving through the familiar roads in a convoy of polished cars. The streets seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different. He had changed more than the city ever could. Children who once played noisily in front of houses now stared silently at the expensive vehicles, unsure whether to be impressed or wary. Obinna's mother greeted him warmly, her hands shaking slightly as she hugged him. His father, older and grayer, remained quiet, watching him with eyes that seemed to weigh every movement. Relatives gathered, offering congratulations, smiles, and polite curiosity. They spoke of his success, his wealth, his influence. But beneath the words, something else lingered. Something unsaid. Elders from the village, men and women who had watched Obinna grow, observed him carefully. At the evening gathering in his family compound, they spoke in hushed tones, telling stories of prosperity, caution, and respect for unseen forces. They spoke indirectly, always, using proverbs and parables. "Some rivers are full of fish, but their currents can drown the careless," one elder said, sipping palm wine. "Even the tallest trees must honor the soil that raised them," another added, glancing at Obinna briefly before looking away. Obinna smiled politely. He laughed at jokes that seemed mildly pointed. He thanked them for their wisdom, though he did not intend to take it seriously. Their words were quaint, their advice old-fashioned. His Lagos experience had taught him that power was controlled, not earned through caution or ritual respect. During the night, as his family slept in the house he had rented in the village, Obinna walked through the compound alone. The familiar earth smelled of rain and wood smoke. The stars above were brighter here than in Lagos. For a moment, a memory of his childhood played in his mind, the games he had played, the lessons he had ignored, the prayers his mother had whispered over him. He paused near the edge of the property, thinking about the warnings disguised as stories. His mind rejected them. He told himself they were fear disguised as wisdom. He told himself he knew better. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt a small shiver of unease. The next morning, during a casual breakfast, an elder approached him alone. "You have done much," the man said softly. "And yet some paths, once taken, cannot be retraced. Watch the shadows in your house. They speak truths the ears cannot hear." Obinna nodded, masking irritation with respect. "I appreciate your concern," he replied. "We must all do what we believe is necessary for our families." The elder's eyes lingered on him. Belief does not always protect. Action does not always save. Obinna forced a polite smile and walked away. He felt the weight of the man's gaze but refused to dwell on it. His life in Lagos had taught him to ignore shadows, to focus on tangible gains, to trust only what he could control. The trip continued smoothly from the outside. Deals were made with old contacts. Suppliers promised loyalty. Money flowed. Yet, during every quiet moment, Obinna could feel the eyes of his village elders on him, sensing the darkness that surrounded him, sensing the costs he had begun to pay silently. He ignored them. Because to acknowledge them was to admit that he had crossed lines. And Obinna had no intention of doing that, not yet. The village, familiar and grounding, became a place of contrast. It reminded him of where he had come from, of who he once was, and of the subtle warnings he had chosen to dismiss. But for Obinna, Lagos awaited. And in Lagos, the rules were different. Shadows, he convinced himself, were meaningless. The call came on a Thursday evening, just as Lagos traffic was slowing and the city's neon lights began to reflect on wet asphalt. Obinna was in his study, reviewing contracts, when his phone buzzed. No number appeared. No name. Only a message: "The time has come." He froze. The words were short, direct, and heavy. His mind immediately raced back to the stranger, Port Harcourt, the first demand, the second demand, Chibuzo's illness. Every memory brought a tightening in his chest. A knock came at the door. Obinna did not answer. The knock came again, sharper, insistent. Slowly, he stood and walked to the door. There was no one outside. Only a note slid beneath it: "What you thought was enough will not suffice. Decide now, or lose everything." The study felt smaller. The city outside glimmered, but Obinna felt trapped. His hands shook slightly as he read the words again. He knew the meaning. The stranger's demands had escalated each time. The first was distance from love. The second, permission for harm. This third demanded something far deeper. Something living, precious, unthinkable. Obinna sank into his chair, pressing his hands over his face. He imagined the consequences, the faces of his children, the look in Ifunanya's eyes, and the fragile pulse of Chibuzo, still struggling to recover. And yet, he understood fully, there was no turning back. Not now. He remembered the stranger's words clearly: "Power is rented. Rent increases." Obinna had already spent so much. Now the rent demanded a price he could not avoid. He looked around his study, at the polished surfaces, the carefully arranged books, the awards, the certificates. Every item symbolized success. But they also reminded him of the path he had chosen, the emotional withdrawal, the silence, the quiet destruction that filled his home. Obinna took a deep breath. He had justified everything so far. He had told himself the costs were acceptable. The benefits, necessary. But now the cost was no longer abstract. No longer delayed. It was immediate. Intimate. Personal. A strange calm settled over him. Not relief. Not joy. Just clarity. He whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "It is time." He did not call Ifunanya. He did not warn anyone. He did not leave evidence of the decision that was about to be made. Because the moment required surrender, not explanation. He remembered the stranger's earlier words: "Intervention is attachment. Acceptance is power." Obinna had accepted before without fully understanding. Now, he understood fully, and acceptance demanded more than he thought possible. The house was quiet. The children were asleep. Chibuzo rested, unaware of the shadow looming over him. Ifunanya, exhausted from worry, lay with her eyes closed, hoping for rest she did not feel. Obinna stood, looking at them. He felt a strange mixture of dread and resolve. He knew that the act he was about to allow or fail to prevent would change everything irreversibly. There would be no chance to go back, no path to reclaim innocence. He closed his eyes briefly, drew in a slow breath, and opened them. The price had arrived. Obinna understood that this was the moment the stranger had been preparing him for all along. A moment where moral certainty collided with ambition. Where family, love, and loyalty clashed with desire, fear, and power. He could feel the weight in his chest, a heavy, living thing pressing down. And yet, he moved forward. Because by now, he knew, power had a cost. And this time, he could not refuse. Ifunanya had always trusted Obinna. She had believed in his vision, his promises, his words. She had accepted silence as focus, coldness as discipline, distance as a necessary price for success. But even the most careful illusions have cracks. It began with a misplaced document. While tidying the study one afternoon, Ifunanya noticed a folder tucked behind a row of accounting files. Curiosity urged her to open it. Inside were papers she had never seen before, receipts for unexplained payments, lists of contacts she did not recognize, notes with names of family members, dates, and symbols she could not immediately understand. Her heart pounded. She began digging. She found patterns in Obinna's business dealings, connections that did not make sense. Projects that succeeded too easily, contracts that arrived without effort, competitors who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Every detail, when connected, pointed toward an orchestrated path of power. And then, more chillingly, she realized that the timing of these miracles coincided precisely with moments when their family suffered Chibuzo's illness, the distancing of their other children, the growing fear in the house. Every instinct screamed at her. The man she had married, the man she had loved, was no longer simply ambitious. He had chosen a path where the well-being of his own family was a currency to be spent for personal gain. She listened to old recordings of phone calls she had made to him during Chibuzo's illness. In each, she could detect the subtle way he deflected concern, minimized danger, and avoided details. Conversations that once felt frustrating now took on a sinister clarity. He had been deliberate. Every word, every gesture, calculated. Ifunanya's hands shook as she placed a paper down. She could see the truth staring back at her, undeniable. Obinna's success, the awards, the applause, the wealth, it had been built not only on focus and intelligence but on the slow, deliberate erosion of their family. She felt anger first. Then disbelief. Then fear. Anger at his coldness, at his manipulations, at the betrayal of the love she had believed in. Disbelief that a man she had married, shared dreams with, could orchestrate suffering for personal advancement. Fear not just for herself, not just for the children, but for the fragility of their lives, their health, their safety. She confronted him that evening, carefully, quietly, holding the papers in her hands. "Obinna," she said, voice low but steady, "what is this?" He looked at her, expression unreadable, and for a moment, she thought he might deny everything. Instead, he smiled faintly, as if he had been expecting her to see it all. "It is necessary," he said simply. "Everything I have done was to protect you, to protect us." She laughed bitterly. "Protect us? You call this protection?" He leaned back in his chair, calm, almost clinical. "I call it survival. Power demands sacrifice. You know that." Ifunanya's hands trembled. "You mean us? Your own children? Your family? You built everything, at our expense." Obinna's eyes flicked briefly, then returned to her gaze. "At the expense of what? Fear? Attachment? Weakness?" She shook her head. "At the expense of love, trust, safety, everything a family is supposed to mean. You've destroyed us for your ambition." The silence that followed was heavier than any anger. Obinna did not defend himself further. He did not raise his voice. He allowed her to feel the full weight of the truth before speaking again. "You understand now," he said quietly. You see the path I have chosen. And you understand that it cannot be undone. Ifunanya looked at him, realizing the horrifying depth of the man she had married, the ambition, the cold calculation, the deliberate cruelty hidden behind success and discipline. For the first time, she feared not only what had already happened, but what was yet to come. And in that moment, she understood fully, their lives, their family, had become a tool. And Obinna had no intention of giving them back. Ifunanya lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of their vast Lagos estate. The house, filled with luxury and silence, seemed emptier than ever. The weight of the truth she had uncovered pressed heavily on her chest. She could not unsee what she had learned. Every success, every award, every applause, it had been purchased at the cost of her family's well-being. Her mind raced. The options were few, and none offered safety or certainty. She could confront Obinna publicly, reveal him to the city, the press, the business world, but the consequences terrified her. He was too powerful, too connected. Even exposing him could put her children in danger. And yet, doing nothing felt like complicity. She moved silently through the house, checking on the children. Adiz slept curled under a blanket, oblivious to the undercurrent of fear that now ran through their home. Chibuzo lay in a guest room they had converted for him after his illness worsened, a pale shadow of the boy he had once been. The sight made her heart ache. Ifunanya sat by the window, hands clasped, trying to make sense of the impossible. How had the man she loved become the architect of her family's suffering? How could the father she trusted now feel so alien, so calculating? And then the thought came, stark and unavoidable, silence could protect them. Every day she remained quiet, every time she pretended ignorance, she gave Obinna freedom. Every nod, every polite smile at his explanations, every moment she withheld the truth from the outside world became a tool in his arsenal. Her restraint became part of his strategy. Her silence nourished the power he had gained. She felt a pang of guilt that twisted into a sharp ache. But the more she considered the alternative, the more dangerous it seemed. Confronting him directly outside the house might provoke a reaction she could not control. Involving authorities might bring scrutiny, lawsuits, or even threats to her children. Public exposure was a gamble she was not sure she, or her family, could survive. And so, she stayed silent. At dinner, Obinna spoke of business developments and contracts as usual, unaware of the storm raging quietly inside her. She smiled at his stories, laughed when appropriate, nodded when he offered advice. Every outward gesture of normalcy was a mask, a carefully measured shield to keep the household intact. But beneath her calm, Ifunanya was changing. Her eyes had grown sharper. Her attention had grown more precise. She began to notice the subtle signs, the way Obinna's mood shifted when certain topics arose, the moments when he glanced at Chibuzo or Adiz with something unreadable, the way his triumphs outside the home always coincided with stress or illness within it. Every silence became a burden. Every decision to protect her children by hiding the truth weighed her down further. It was a slow erosion of self, an invisible sacrifice that went unnoticed by everyone except her. Yet she understood the necessity. She had to survive, to shield her children from the man she now recognized as a predator in a tailored suit, a family destroyed slowly by ambition and cunning. In the stillness of the night, Ifunanya whispered to herself, "I will stay silent. I will protect them. Even if it costs me everything." And so silence became complicity. But complicity, she realized, was not strength. It was survival. And in Obinna's carefully constructed world, survival was exactly what he demanded, even if it was at the expense of the woman who had once been his partner. Obinna had everything he once prayed for, yet sleep had become a stranger to him. Night after night, he lay awake in his large bed, eyes open, listening to the soft hum of generators in the distance and the steady breathing of a house that no longer brought him comfort. The mattress was expensive, the room perfectly designed for rest, but peace refused to enter. When he closed his eyes, his mind did not quiet. It sharpened. He replayed conversations that had already ended. He examined glances, pauses, and silences, searching for threats that might not exist. Every sound in the house felt deliberate. Every shadow seemed slightly out of place. He began to feel watched. Not in a dramatic way, not with footsteps or voices, but with a constant pressure, as if something unseen was always just behind him. When he walked through the corridors at night, he sometimes stopped abruptly and turned, convinced someone stood there. There was never anyone. Still, the feeling remained. Obinna installed more security cameras, more alarms, more guards. The estate was already secure, but security no longer reassured him. It only reminded him of how much he feared losing control. His paranoia extended beyond the house. At work, he trusted no one fully. He reread emails repeatedly before sending them. He questioned the loyalty of long-term partners. He suspected hidden motives in simple conversations. Success had not relaxed him. It had tightened him. He noticed that his body was changing too. His appetite faded. His hands shook slightly when he held his phone late at night. His temper shortened. Small inconveniences angered him more than they should have. Sometimes, he felt the urge to speak, to explain himself, to confess, to demand reassurance from someone. But the moment passed quickly. Words felt dangerous. Silence felt safer. Ifunanya watched him carefully now. She said little. Her quiet presence unsettled him more than confrontation would have. He wondered what she knew, how much she suspected, whether she was planning something. Even his children's fear weighed on him differently now. Their avoidance no longer felt like a necessary distance. It felt like judgment. Their eyes seemed to linger on him a moment too long, as if they sensed something he could not erase. Late one night, Obinna sat alone in his study, lights dimmed, glass untouched on the desk. He stared at the wall where his awards were displayed. Each one gleamed under soft lighting, symbols of achievement meant to inspire pride. Instead, they accused him. He felt the familiar presence then, not a figure, not a sound, but a certainty. The same certainty he felt in Port Harcourt. The same certainty that had followed every demand. You are being watched. Not by cameras. Not by enemies. By the power he had chosen. He realized then that peace had never been part of the agreement. Success, protection, control, yes. Peace, no. Obinna leaned back in his chair and laughed quietly, a sound without humor. He finally understood the cruel balance of what he had gained. The city admired him. His bank accounts grew. His influence expanded. But his mind was no longer his own. As dawn approached, he remained awake, eyes burning, body exhausted. Outside, Lagos prepared for another busy day. Inside, Obinna sat alone with his fear, his power, and the unbearable knowledge that nothing he had gained could silence what now lived inside him. Power had given him everything, and taken the one thing he could no longer buy. The streets of Lagos no longer hummed with admiration when Obinna walked among them. The city that once celebrated his rise had begun to shift, subtly at first, then unmistakably. It began with the meetings. Longtime business partners who had once greeted him with warmth now offered polite smiles, careful handshakes, and vague excuses to leave early. Invitations to dinners and events became rare or never came at all. Phone calls went unanswered, or replies arrived delayed and cold. Obinna noticed the change immediately, though he tried to dismiss it. People are busy, he told himself. Competition is natural. But then the whispers began. Rumors circulated quietly at first, obscure hints about unethical practices, accusations too vague to verify, stories of mysterious illnesses and misfortunes in his family. They were never direct, never accusatory, but enough to seed doubt. Enough to make partners pause. Enough to make investors second guess. The press, once friendly, became cautious. Articles about his achievements now carried subtle qualifiers. Critics wonder about his methods, or unexplained success raises questions. Interviews that once praised him ended with carefully worded questions about transparency and ethics. Obinna tried to assert control. He called partners, offered reassurances, presented documentation, hired PR specialists, and crafted careful explanations. But the city was no longer malleable. The warmth he had known, the admiration, the deference was fading, replaced by skepticism and distance. Even his allies within his own companies seemed affected. Managers hesitated before speaking, employees whispered in corners, and loyalty felt conditional rather than automatic. Obinna sensed eyes on him constantly, assessing, calculating, doubting. The irony was sharp. He had spent years bending the world to his will, sacrificing his family, his conscience, and his peace for power. Yet the city he had conquered began to recoil as if it had smelled the cost of that power and recoiled in disgust. Obinna tried to retreat into work, focusing on deals, contracts, and expansions. But everything carried a subtle weight now. Negotiations were tense. Promises were questioned. Doors that had once opened effortlessly now remained closed, locked by invisible hands of doubt. Even in his luxurious Lagos estate, the shift was palpable. Couriers, drivers, and staff behaved differently, hesitant, observant, wary. The children sensed it too. Adiz noticed that visitors did not smile freely. Chibuzo, fragile as ever, seemed more alert to tension in the house. Obinna felt the change deep inside. The city, the very entity that had elevated him, was becoming cold. He could no longer rely on public perception or past triumphs. Every move required calculation, every word measured. He realized that power without peace was one thing, but power without trust was another. And Lagos, the city that once cheered his name, had begun to withdraw its favor quietly, almost silently, leaving him to face a truth he had long tried to ignore. Even the highest towers could feel the chill of isolation. Obinna stood on the balcony that evening, looking out over the glittering skyline. The lights of the city were beautiful, but they no longer seemed welcoming. The warmth of applause, the smiles of allies, the admiration of the public all had faded. The city had turned cold. And Obinna knew, deep in his bones, that this chill was only the beginning. The confrontation came quietly, almost unexpectedly, yet its weight struck Obinna harder than any public criticism or whispered rumor. It was late afternoon. The Lagos sun had begun to dip behind the tall buildings, casting long shadows across the estate's polished floors. Obinna was reviewing contracts in his study, the silence of the house pressing in. He had grown accustomed to tension, to quiet obedience, to the careful avoidance of his presence by everyone under his roof. Adiz appeared at the doorway, her posture hesitant but determined. She no longer flinched as she had in the past, and yet the weight in her eyes made him pause. "Daddy," she said, her voice steady but trembling slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Obinna looked up, expecting something trivial, a question about school, a minor complaint. He nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. Adiz stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind her. Why are you like this?" she asked, her small hands gripping the edge of a chair. "Why do you make us afraid? Why is home not home anymore?" Obinna's chest tightened. He had never been confronted this directly. He had watched their fear grow, their retreat into silence, their small, cautious movements around him, but he had never been asked to face it openly. He began, then paused. Words felt foreign, heavy, and insufficient. He tried to explain, to justify, to offer something that could lessen her fear. But how could he explain the stranger, the demands, the choices he had made? How could he confess the terrible bargain that had brought him wealth while leaving their hearts fractured? Adiz continued, tears brimming but controlled. "We are your children," she said. "We are supposed to feel safe with you. But we don't. We are scared, and Chibuzo, he's sick, and it's because of you, isn't it?" Obinna froze. The accusation, though quiet, pierced him with the force of truth he had avoided for so long. His own child had named it openly, the human cost of his ambition, the suffering he had inflicted, whether by action or inaction. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling a mix of shame, guilt, and an unfamiliar helplessness. He wanted to defend himself. He wanted to explain that everything he had done was meant to protect them, to secure their future. But the words felt hollow, meaningless against the raw honesty of her gaze. I wanted to make things better," he whispered, voice tight. "I thought I was doing the right thing, for all of us." Adiz shook her head. "The right thing doesn't make us afraid. The right thing doesn't make us sick. The right thing doesn't take our home from us while keeping the shiny things." Obinna felt the weight of her words settle like stones in his chest. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw fear, hurt, and disappointment intertwined in a way he could not ignore. For the first time, he realized that wealth, power, and success had no meaning without the love and trust of those he held closest. All the contracts, the applause, the business victories, they were meaningless if his children trembled at the sight of him. Adi's voice softened, almost pleading. "I don't know who you are anymore, Daddy. I want to, but I can't." Obinna sat back, the papers in front of him forgotten. The city outside continued its noisy rhythm, indifferent to his inner collapse. He understood now, with brutal clarity, that every gain he had made had a human cost that could not be erased. He opened his mouth to speak, to promise, to justify, but no words came that could bridge the distance he had created. And for the first time, Obinna felt the full weight of what he had done. The cost of power was no longer abstract. It was human. And it was staring him directly in the eyes. The stranger appeared without warning, as he always did, yet with a presence that made even Obinna, now hardened by ambition and fear, pause in his tracks. It was midnight. The estate was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning. Obinna sat alone in the living room, staring at a half-empty glass of whiskey. The weight of Adi's confrontation still lingered in his chest. He had not moved from his chair for hours, unwilling or perhaps unable to act. A sudden knock echoed through the house, soft, deliberate. Obinna's heart tightened. "Come in," he called, voice steady though his mind raced. The stranger stepped inside, his figure calm, deliberate, and impossibly certain. He did not remove his coat. He did not sit. He merely observed, as if surveying a property long overdue for inspection. "You have done well," the stranger said, voice low and even. "Better than most. Smarter than most. But it has never been yours." Obinna's fingers tightened around the glass. "What are you talking about?" "You thought you controlled the bargain," the stranger said, stepping closer, his eyes sharp. "You thought distance, sacrifices, obedience, everything you offered meant you had power. You never did. You never do." Obinna swallowed hard. I followed the terms. I did everything you asked. Everything you were told to do was already accounted for," the stranger interrupted. "Everything you loved, everything you protected, everything you thought was yours, claimed long before you believed you had a choice." Obinna felt the words land like stones in his chest. His mind raced through his family, Chibuzo's illness, Adi's fear, Ifunanya's silent strength. Every act he had justified, every restraint he had maintained, every gain he had celebrated, all of it had been manipulated, orchestrated, predetermined. "Why?" Obinna asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why show me this now?" "Because you must understand," the stranger said simply. "Power comes with the illusion of control. The illusion keeps you willing. The illusion keeps you obedient. You have been a careful student. You have followed the lessons faithfully. Yet none of it belonged to you." Obinna felt an emptiness open inside him, cold and unyielding. The room seemed smaller, the walls pressing in. He thought of his children, of Ifunanya, of the fragile life he had tried to preserve, and realized with horror that even his efforts to protect them had been part of the bargain he never controlled. The stranger's gaze softened slightly, almost imperceptibly, but the weight of inevitability remained. "Do not look for blame in your heart," he said. "You have been obedient. You have been disciplined. You have done exactly what was required. And yet, everything that matters to you is already claimed." Obinna's hands dropped to his knees. He felt the full magnitude of the truth. Wealth, influence, accolades, all temporary and hollow. The human cost, the fear, the fractured family, they were permanent. And he could not undo them. "Then what?" he began, but the stranger's voice cut through before he could finish. "Then you watch," the stranger said. "And you learn. And you understand that bargains are never owned. They are endured." Obinna wanted to argue. He wanted to fight. He wanted to reclaim what had been his. But he knew in that moment that resistance was meaningless. The stranger turned, walking toward the door. His coat brushed the floor, silent. Before leaving, he paused, voice just above a whisper. "Your choices shaped the path. But the outcome, The outcome was never yours to control. And then he was gone. Obinna remained seated, staring at the darkened doorway. The house was silent again. The city outside continued to hum with life, indifferent to the collapse that had just occurred inside these walls. Everything he loved, his children, his wife, the fragile remnants of trust and warmth, was already claimed. And Obinna finally understood that in seeking power, he had given up the only things that had ever truly mattered. The weight of inevitability settled around him like a second skin. And Lagos waited, indifferent and cold, as the man who had once thought himself master of destiny realized he had never controlled a single thread of it. The house that had once symbolized Obinna's triumph now felt like a tomb. Silence had grown heavier over the years, and fear had calcified into routine. The family he had sacrificed so much to protect could no longer endure the weight of his presence. Ifunanya was the first to leave. She had spent countless nights wrestling with fear, guilt, and despair, watching her children shrink under Obinna's authority and the invisible hand that governed their lives. One morning, she packed a single bag for herself and the children. She left a note, careful not to confront him directly, explaining that they needed safety, peace, and distance, things the mansion could no longer offer. Chibuzo, frail but alert, clung to his mother's side. Adiz walked quietly beside them, carrying the unease that had grown like a shadow around her. Even the youngest children, sensing the fracture in the home, followed silently, not asking questions they already knew the answers to. Obinna awoke that day to an empty house, the rooms echoing with the absence of life he had once controlled. The silence was suffocating. No laughter. No whispers. No timid footsteps. Only the hum of electricity and the faint creak of the polished floors. He searched the house, room by room. Every object reminded him of what he had lost, the expensive furniture, the awards, the luxury cars, the contracts he had fought so hard to secure. They were all meaningless now. The wealth remained, untouched, sterile, incapable of restoring the warmth he had destroyed. Obinna tried to call them. Phones went unanswered. Messages were ignored. He sent security to locate them, only to find that Ifunanya had arranged for discretion. No one would answer for him. In the city, life went on. Lagos continued to applaud, to negotiate, to trade, unaware of the quiet ruin within Obinna's walls. His businesses remained profitable, his name still respected among the elite, his power unquestioned in boardrooms and conferences. But he was alone. Utterly, painfully alone. The children had scattered to relatives, boarding schools, or distant friends. Each one carried the memory of fear, the memory of nights spent under the weight of a father they could not trust. Adiz, though older now, refused to look at him when he passed through crowded city streets. Chibuzo, still recovering slowly, spoke little and smiled rarely. Ifunanya rebuilt cautiously, carefully, shielded by distance and resolve. She refused to let Obinna's shadow touch their lives again, determined to restore what little normalcy they could reclaim. Obinna remained in the estate, surrounded by servants and the trappings of wealth, but he could not escape the emptiness. Every meal, every conversation with business associates, every congratulatory message felt hollow. He realized that success, when purchased at the cost of love, left only a cold echo. The mansion, once a symbol of achievement, became a mausoleum of regret. Every room reminded him of choices made, opportunities to act differently ignored, and the family he had sacrificed to climb higher. Even the city that once welcomed him warmly now felt distant. Awards and honors no longer brought pride. Contracts no longer excited him. Wealth had become meaningless in isolation. Obinna walked through the empty halls, touching the polished surfaces, listening for the faintest sign of life. Nothing answered. No laughter. No footsteps. Only silence and the constant, unyielding reminder that he had won everything but lost what truly mattered. The lesson was cruel and undeniable. Ambition without conscience could create power, but it could never recreate love, trust, or family. And so he remained, a titan in the eyes of the city, but a ghost in the house he had built. Alone. Completely, irrevocably alone. Obinna sat alone in the grand living room of his Lagos mansion, the city lights spilling faintly through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The house, vast and luxurious, felt empty, its silence heavier than any crowd, colder than any night. He stared at the polished floor, at the awards lining the walls, at the contracts and ledgers that once gave him purpose. He thought of his children, Adiz, Chibuzo, and the others, scattered and wary. He thought of Ifunanya, who had protected them with courage he could never match. He remembered the confrontation, the stranger's words, the bargains he had made. Every memory carried weight, each a reminder of what he had sacrificed for the sake of power. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and watched the amber liquid catch the dim light. The taste, once comforting, now felt bitter. His mind, so used to calculating deals and strategies, had no answers for the question that now consumed him. Was it worth it? Was all the wealth, the influence, the accolades, worth becoming the enemy of his own blood? Obinna leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the crushing emptiness of his triumph. For decades, he had pursued control, status, and success, believing that the end justified the means. But in the quiet of his mansion, with no applause to echo his name and no family to share his victories, he realized that power had a cost he could not quantify. The question gnawed at him endlessly. He could not silence it. He could not negotiate with it, bribe it, or ignore it. It was there in every shadow, in every empty room, in every echo of the life he had destroyed. And the more he thought, the less he knew. Obinna took another sip and whispered to himself, though the silence answered nothing. Was it truly worth it? He paused, staring into the darkened city beyond the glass, and the question lingered, unanswered, heavy, and endless. Now, we turn to you. If you were in Obinna's place, facing unimaginable power and impossible choices, what would you have done? Would ambition justify the cost of family, or is there a line that should never be crossed? Comment below with your thoughts. What would you have sacrificed, and what would you refuse to give up?